It was a cold and snowy Christmas Eve, the kind where every sound felt muffled by the thick, heavy blanket of snow. I had made the decision to take the train that evening, a choice I wasn't particularly looking forward to. The thought of enduring the typical holiday rush, the crowded platforms, the forced cheer, the endless chatter was exhausting. For the first time in years, I was spending Christmas alone. My family had all gone their separate ways, and I just wanted to escape the suffocating weight of the holiday spirit. The idea of riding a train through the desolate countryside, where silence reigned, seemed like the perfect way to clear my mind. The station was eerily quiet when I arrived. Snowflakes fell steadily, shimmering under the faint glow of the station lights. They coated the ground, transforming everything into a pristine, otherworldly scene. The stillness in the air was unsettling. It felt as though the station was holding its breath. On the platform, there was only one train, sitting alone, as if it had been waiting for me. It wasn't a sleek, modern commuter train like the ones I was used to. No, this was something different. The train was an antique, a relic from another era. Its carriages were made of dark, polished wood, with brass fittings and faded gold trim that whispered of long-forgotten luxury. Standing at the entrance was a conductor. He was tall and thin, his sharp features etched with weariness. His uniform was outdated, like something from an old photograph, and looked as though it hadn't been touched by modern hands in decades. He didn't smile or speak, just gave me a brief nod. His gaze was tired and distant, as if he had been doing this for far too long. A chill ran down my spine, but I dismissed it as a reaction to the cold. After all, it was late. I was tired, and the silence of the station wasn't helping. I stepped onto the train and made my way down the aisle. The car was nearly empty, save for a few scattered bags. The wooden floor creaked beneath my boots, and the dim lighting cast long shadows that danced with the sway of the train. I found a seat by the window and settled in, pulling my scarf tighter around my neck. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. The soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic sway of the train were oddly soothing. But no matter how hard I tried to relax, a nagging unease crept into my mind. The train jolted forward, lurching out of the station and into the darkness. As the station lights disappeared behind us, the landscape transformed into an endless expanse of snow-covered fields and forests. For the first hour, the journey was uneventful. I tried reading a book to distract myself, but the words blurred together on the page. My mind began to wander, drawn back to the strangeness of the train. I hadn't seen any other passengers, aside from a fleeting glimpse of a man disappearing into the back of the train. Then I heard it. It started faint, barely audible over the sound of the engine, a soft tapping against the window. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. For a moment, I thought it might just be the wind or the motion of the train, but the tapping came again, rhythmic and deliberate. I turned to look out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. There was nothing but darkness beyond the snow. No trees, no buildings, no signs of life, just an endless void. The tapping stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving me with a lingering sense of unease. I scanned the empty car, my eyes darting to the dark corners, half expecting to see something or someone, but the car was still empty. The train continued its journey, but the atmosphere had shifted. The warmth from the heater faded, replaced by an icy chill that seeped into my bones. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to shake the feeling that I was no longer alone. The tapping returned, louder this time, joined by a faint scratching sound. It was coming from the far end of the car. I turned quickly, my eyes searching for the source of the noise. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow dart across the aisle, small, hunched, almost childlike. I blinked, and it was gone. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way through the walls of the train. My breathing quickened, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The conductor appeared at the far end of the car, carrying something in his hands. I tried to call out to him, but my voice caught in my throat. He didn't look at me as he passed, his footsteps eerily silent on the wooden floor. That's when I noticed the door. It was an old compartment door, made of dark wood with frosted glass, and it was slightly ajar. I could hear something faint, a shuffling sound, like movement inside. Summoning what little courage I had left, I stood up and made my way toward the door. My legs felt heavy, as though the air around me had thickened. The temperature dropped further with each step, the chill biting into my skin. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Slowly, I pulled it open. The compartment was empty. At least, that's what I thought at first. In the center of the room sat an old, battered suitcase. The leather was cracked and worn, and a faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and opened the suitcase. Inside was a single, tattered Christmas mask. The mask's surface was cracked. Its once bright colors faded with age. Its hollow eyes stared back at me, and its twisted grin sent a shiver down my spine. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the compartment, and the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, tugging at the handle. The door wouldn't budge. The tapping returned, louder and more frantic. It wasn't coming from the window this time, it was coming from inside the compartment. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The suitcase began to shake, and the mask inside seemed to twist and writhe, as though it were alive. And then I saw it. In the corner of the compartment, a small figure began to take shape. It was wearing a mask identical to the one in the suitcase. Its body was frail, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its black, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of dread unlike anything I had ever experienced. The door suddenly flew open, and I stumbled back into the aisle, gasping for air. The figure didn't follow, but I could still feel its presence, lingering just beyond the threshold. The train began to slow, its rhythmic motion faltering as though it were struggling to continue. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the nearest exit, my footsteps echoing in the empty car. When the train finally came to a stop, I didn't hesitate. I stepped out into the cold night, the snow stinging my face as I caught my breath. But when I turned back to look at the train, it was gone. The platform was empty. The tracks were empty. It was as if the train had never existed. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. Every Christmas Eve, when the snow begins to fall, I find myself thinking about the Midnight Express. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear it again, a faint tapping in the distance. Closing statement. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Stay safe out there, and remember, sometimes the scariest journeys are the ones you take alone. Christmas Eve had always been a magical night for me, a time for family, laughter, and the warm glow of twinkling lights. But this year was different. Instead of sipping hot cocoa by the fireplace with my family, I was trudging through the snow toward the train station after a grueling day at work. My body ached, and all I could think about was getting home to collapse in bed. The streets were eerily empty as I made my way to the station. Snowflakes fell gently, muffling the world around me. The distant hum of festive music played from a shop window, but it felt hollow, as though the cheer couldn't quite reach me. When I arrived at the station, the emptiness struck me. Normally bustling with commuters and last-minute holiday travelers, the platform was deserted. Even the ticket booth was closed, its windows dark. I glanced at the schedule board. It read 12 o'clock. Last train to Coldridge. Then I saw it, already waiting on the platform. A train I'd never seen before. It looked ancient, its exterior battered and streaked with rust. The windows were darkened, and faint streaks of frost clung to the glass. The snow seemed untouched around the train, as if it had simply appeared there, bypassing the tracks entirely. I hesitated, a prickle of unease running down my spine. Something about this train wasn't right, but the thought of waiting out in the freezing cold, for who knew how long, was unbearable. I shook off my doubts and stepped aboard. The moment I entered, the air shifted. It was colder inside than it had been outside, an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. The car was dimly lit, with old-fashioned lantern-style lights that flickered as if they might go out at any moment. The seats were upholstered in faded red fabric, their edges worn and frayed. The faint scent of mildew hung in the air, mixed with something metallic and sour. At the far end of the car stood a conductor. His back was to me, his posture rigid. He wore a uniform that looked decades out of place, complete with a brass pocket watch and a peaked cap. I opened my mouth to ask if the train was heading to Coldridge, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about him was wrong. I chose a seat near the middle of the car, close to the window. The glass was fogged, and I wiped it with my sleeve to peer outside. The station platform was barely visible through the swirling snow, and beyond it, the world was an endless white void. The train jolted forward with a lurch, and I pressed my hand against the seat in front of me to steady myself. The lights flickered again, plunging the car into brief darkness before buzzing back to life. I glanced around the car, noticing for the first time that there were others aboard. A man sat a few rows ahead, his head tilted back as if he were asleep. Across the aisle, an elderly woman clutched a small parcel in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor. Further back, a teenage boy was staring out the window, his expression vacant. The train's rhythm clack, 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 clack was almost hypnotic, lulling me into a strange calm despite the eerie atmosphere. My eyes drifted shut for a moment. That's when I heard it. A faint, high-pitched sobbing. My eyes snapped open, and I sat upright, straining to hear over the clatter of the train wheels. The sound was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder closer. It was the cry of a child. I turned, scanning the car, but none of the other passengers reacted. The man up front still slouched in his seat. The elderly woman hadn't moved, and the teenager remained glued to the window. The sobbing continued, growing more desperate. My chest tightened, a mix of concern and unease pushing me to stand. I hesitated, glancing at the passengers one last time, but they seemed oblivious. Swallowing my nerves, I moved toward the sound. As I reached the door at the rear of the car, the sobbing stopped. The silence was deafening, amplifying the pounding of my heart. I gripped the cold metal handle and slid the door open. The next car was empty. It was darker than the first, the lights barely functioning. The seats here were in worse condition, the fabric ripped and spilling foam. The air smelled musty, like it hadn't been touched in years. Then I saw her. A little girl stood at the far end of the car, her back to me. She was small, maybe 6 or 7, and wore a tattered dress that looked like it had been pulled from another era. Her hair was long and matted, hanging down her back in tangled waves. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't move. I took a cautious step forward. "Do you need help?" Slowly, she turned. My breath caught in my throat. Her face was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes empty black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind her, the shadows seemed to move, writhing like living things. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back. The lights flickered violently, and the car was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, she was gone. The train jolted again, harder this time, throwing me against the seats. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The air had grown impossibly cold, and frost crept across the windows, forming jagged, unnatural patterns. I turned to go back to my seat, but the car was different now. The passengers were gone, the seats empty and covered in a thin layer of frost. The sobbing returned, louder and more frantic, accompanied by whispers, low, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all around me. I ran. I tore through car after car, each one more decayed than the last. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and the lights barely flickered. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a cacophony of voices. Finally, I reached the front of the train. The conductor stood there, staring straight ahead. "Please, stop the train," I shouted, my voice cracking. He turned slowly, and I froze. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He smiled, revealing teeth that were unnaturally sharp. "We've reached your stop," he said, his voice a low rasp. The train screeched to a halt, and I was thrown to the floor. When I looked up, the conductor was gone. The doors opened, and I stumbled out onto a desolate platform. The snow was untouched, the world silent. The train behind me vanished into the darkness, leaving no tracks behind. For years, I've searched for answers, but no records of that train exist. Every Christmas Eve, I find myself listening for its whistle, wondering if it will come for me again.